Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. For this episode, I'm very lucky to be joined by Raging Mandrill. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excellent on this wonderful Tuesday.
And if I recall, the last time I had you on my channel was actually about a year ago. I think we were talking about principles of warfare, if I recall correctly.
That is correct. Yes, that was an excellent stream.
No, I enjoyed it very much. And when we get into tonight's topic, I don't think warfare is sort of tangentially related and relating to the subject, but we probably won't delve into it too much. So, the topic, if people are wondering, as you've seen from the name of the stream, is the first Churchills miniseries. Now, what is the first Churchills? Well, Mandrill, about a month ago, you tweeted this out on Twitter saying, "Has anybody seen this series? It's quite good." And I said, "No, I haven't. I should give it a watch." And what it's all about is about the British military commander John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, and his wife Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and it's all about sort of their career in the sort of second sort of last quarter of the 17th century and into the sort of first several years of the 18th century, and as people may have gathered from the name, yes, John Churchill is the ancestor of the British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill, and what's interesting is the show is actually based upon Churchill's biography of his ancestor. And why I find this show so interesting is the one not only does it cover a very interesting period of history, but obviously it's informed by the beliefs and agenda of Marlborough's descendants of Winston Churchill. And I think there are certain uh, political and I think cultural reasons why Churchill wanted to write this book and we got this series and certain narratives it's trying to put forward, which we'll get into. So what was your sort of initial and overall impressions of the show, Mandrill?
Well, I actually watched this show originally, I think it was almost 10 years ago now, when I first saw it. Um, it's interesting because a lot of people ask me for TV watching recommendations. And of course, with everything being as terrible as it is these days, really need to dig deep into the archive to find quality content to watch. And not like, because how many podcasts can you really conceivably go through, right? At some point, you that's entirely audio, right? You need audio and visual at the same time in order to like truly be engaged with something and to be entertained. And there's just not any TV. So I think like digging into the archives is one strategy that people can do in order to overcome the current malaise in content. Um, so that was my basic first selling point for the audience. What really drew me to this period is I have a vested fascination with the 17th century and with pike and shot warfare. So naturally, this being the latter portions of the 17th century, beginning in the reign, really the early part of the reign of Le Roi Soleil, Louis the Sun King, basically, who's the King of France, who's more of a antagonist in the show, if anything else. He's like a constant thorn in the side of the English. Apparently, he's just always there. He never goes away. He's just like the constant boogeyman.
And no, I agree with you. And what's interesting is the first several episodes where you see a brief glimpse of him. He's just like idly like playing with like his fish tank, and he doesn't even speak. He just seems to be like this strange like foreign like entity, and it's like ooh, and he's always like reading messages from like his courts and like ambassador in England, and it's only in the past couple of episodes he actually does speak.
Right. He's almost like a weird like puppet master kind of figure because he's obviously calling the shots and he's receiving information, but he never actually like is acting in the world. It's always other people who are doing stuff for him. I think the first episode is really interesting because Churchill, or John Churchill, it basically is in the service of the Sun King in the Netherlands. Basically, he's fighting for Louis against the Dutch, if I'm not mistaken. And there's the interesting scene where he almost gets killed, right? Because they're attacking an open breach in a fortress, and they have to decide in a moment, basically, who's got to go first. And so basically the French, like, chump insert character basically decides, okay, well, I fight for Louis, I get paid, so I'm going to go into the breach first. And of course he gets killed, and somehow John and his buddy survive.
No, it's interesting because there's just to set a chronology. So the show begins. So with this war, this is actually the Anglo-French War, and this is 1673. And what's interesting is around the same time, because England was actually in an alliance with the French. It's very interesting because this is the reign of Charles II in England. It's about midway through his reign, and the reason this alliance comes about is because Louis basically grants Charles a subsidy because Charles is dependent on Parliament to raise revenue. Because Charles wants to be more independent of Parliament, Louis grants him a subsidy so he doesn't have to rely on Parliament for raising of taxation. But in exchange, he expects Charles to support certain foreign policy initiatives of his. And so at the same time that the French go to war, the English also go to war in what was the Third Anglo-Dutch War. It doesn't go that well, and due to the lack of support at home, Charles ends up having to bail out. But what he does is that in exchange for keeping the subsidy, he allows the English troops to effectively serve under a French banner, so effectively they're mercenaries, and that's a way to get around and not being at war with the Dutch. He just basically leases off his forces to the French, and essentially from something, because later on in the episode, there's a moment where Churchill's back home and he's talking to his friend, the Duke of Monmouth, who's the illegitimate son
Right.
of Charles II, who he does actually meet when he's on campaign in France, because he was the commander of the English forces, Monmouth. And he sort of says to him that, this doesn't feel just, that we're English and we're going off and fighting under a French flag, and the French were like just using us as like cannon fodder. They weren't, treating us very fairly.
Right. I think it's this is an interesting point too, because he is essentially saying, look, we're fighting a war that's not our business to fight, and yet we are fighting in battles that are essentially inconclusive. Yet there's a broad scale, a massive scale of slaughter of our own people. And why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense, right? It's it is totally like illegitimate in Churchill's eyes.
No, certainly. And again, I think we see the beginning of the kind of character they're trying to build of him. He's essentially presented throughout the show as this selfless military officer who only wants to do what's best for England, and all of his sort of career advancement is all down to his, selfless patriotism and his merits, so to speak. Which
Right.
is not entirely false, but as we'll get into, it's that there's more to it than what they present.
Yeah, I think this would be a good jumping off point to introduce his future wife, Sarah, because in the first couple of episodes, there's a little bit of drama where the courtship process between John and Sarah is a difficult one. And the reason for this is largely due to John's lack of money, and essentially he is for better or for worse, as much as a real aristocrat could be, a self-made man, or at least that's the way he's portrayed anyway. But Sarah is completely penniless, and so there's this gigantic drama between Sarah and her mother about John Churchill and why she shouldn't be marrying him, but rather should be marrying some other more wealthy gentleman in the court. And of course, this is the court of Charles II, right, who is wonderfully played by James Villiers, right, who if I understand is actually related to Charles II.
James, I did look this up. So James Villiers, so he belongs to the Villiers family, which are a British noble family. And it's really interesting because in the first episode, there's a scene where Churchill is sneaks into the bedroom of the Duchess of Cleveland, who was Charles II's mistress, and her name was Barbara Villiers. So Charles II's mistress is the ancestor of the actor who actually plays Charles in the show, which I thought was quite funny. So.
Yeah, it is interesting. But if you look at pictures or paintings of Charles II, you can kind of see a bit of a family resemblance between him and Villiers. I thought that was a very well cast role for sure.
No, I agree. I love his portrayal, and yeah, then there's a scene where the maid's trying to hold up the king as he comes to visit his mistress, and then John Churchill has to jump out the window to escape.
Right, right. I mean, the court is clearly degenerated. This is the post-Puritan period, so everybody is in the mood to have a little bit of fun, I think, and so of course with that comes a few excesses, and I think the return of something that might approximate a courtly love is interesting to watch, and is actually quite entertaining because. Oh shoot, what was her name? John Churchill's lover, who's also sorry, I'm forgetting her name now.
So do you mean the woman he sneaks into the bedroom?
Yes, yes.
That's so Barbara Villiers, the Duchess of
Barbara
Cleveland.
Villiers. Yeah, Barbara. Yeah, she has a little interesting, funny rhyme that she says about Jack, Jack, flat on my back. What do I lack? Only my Jack. And like, even though I can't remember her name, like the rhyme sticks with you. It's just it's so catchy.
I know, certainly. And what I also find really interesting with Charles is that because he was married to a Portuguese princess, I think it's Maria de Braganza, and the whole reason he married her, it was to kind of renew the Anglo-Portuguese alliance after Portugal became independent again from Spain. And what I find interesting is that she's not in the show at all. You only see Charles's mistresses.
Well, I mean, that's also probably fairly accurate. His Charles's court has a reputation for a reason, and I think the omission of the Portuguese queen is probably demonstrates that very well in the series, shall we say?
And no, of course. And just to go back to Sarah Churchill, because another thing we should make people aware who are watching that throughout the whole series, Sarah Churchill is the narrator, so she'll often narrate bits, and it's like she's there in her older self narrating back about the events of the past, and that's sort of happening throughout. And you're right, when there's in this initial courtship, because something to bear in mind, which I don't think is quite clear in the show, is that John and Sarah Churchill, there was about 10 years difference in age between them, because he was born in 1650, so he would have been 23 at the start of the show. I think he was 27 or 28 when they met, or maybe 25, and she would have been at 15. So yeah, she's still obviously a minor when they meet. So that just shows you how much of an age difference there was. And they do actually end up marrying 2 years later when she's 17. And what is really interesting is something we do see in the second episode is we never actually see Churchill's father, but he often receives correspondence and talks about the conversations he's had with his father off screen. And his father wants him to marry a wealthy woman, because another thing we should do to provide context is that so Churchill was born in 1650, and so obviously he was born during the time of Cromwell and the Commonwealth, and his father was actually a man of the gentry, so of reasonable means, but not like an aristocrat, and he was a gentleman who had supported the Cavaliers or the Royalists during the Civil War, and the Churchill family had actually suffered quite a bit as a result of basically backing the losing side, and something that is very clear with the real Churchill, and I think does bleed through into the show, is this idea of he doesn't want to be on the losing side again, ultimately politically, which I think informs a lot of his decisions. And it's really interesting that, again, he defies his father by not marrying this woman called Catherine Sedley, who's quite wealthy. And there's a scene where she actually is waiting in his house for him, and he rejects her, and then she just throws a tantrum and throws a goblet at him and then storms out. And again, this is another interesting characterization of him. It's he's not motivated by power or wealth. He marries for love, and that actually is accurate from what reading I've done. He genuinely did want to marry for love, and didn't just marry Sarah because I thought, was she actually wealthy or something? And the show's trying to make her look more modest, but no, that's actually accurate.
Yeah, I liked that bit as well. The drama, obviously, which comes through due to the politics and how that plays out in people's personal lives and the decisions that they as individuals make. This was very well done in the series, I thought. I think you'll see in certain periods of the series, Churchill, he's very pragmatic, and he tends to he does shift his colors occasionally, but it's usually for a very pragmatic reason. Like he always ends up on top. He's never on the losing side, almost ever. Um, and I think the biggest example of that is the later in the series when they actually finally get around to the Glorious Revolution. I mean, he's on the side of William of Orange. He backs William of Orange pretty early on over over shoot
James Duke of York or James II.
yes, yeah, James the Duke of York. Sorry, yeah. So he doesn't back the Duke of York for it's partially for religious reasons, but the way that the story is told it's for more pragmatic reasons is the reason why he's doing it.
Well, I think it's worth maybe looking at the relationships between John and Sarah and the court around them, because it's very interesting to look at the Churchill's relationship with James Duke of York, because the Duke of York was effectively his patron from his his early years and career, because the Duke of York was the commander in chief of the British Army, and obviously John Churchill is a soldier. He's an officer, and he's actually an officer in the Duke of York's regiment, I believe, during the early years of the series, and he's actually then commissioned sort of as an officer of the court. And something that is actually omitted from the show, which I looked into, is that that the relationship between the two actually goes back a bit further. So Churchill had a sister called Arabella, and Arabella was the maid of honour to Mary Hyde, who was the first wife of James Duke of York. And by the time of the show, Mary has died. She was the mother of his two daughters, future Mary II and Queen Anne. And the second wife in the show is Maria of Modena, an Italian duchess. But what's interesting is that Arabella Churchill, who was the maid of honour to the Duke of York's first wife, she later becomes his mistress, and that's completely cut out of the show. She doesn't even appear. And it's through this connection how Churchill gets sort of the favour of the Duke. So that he actually becomes a page, who's an official palace sort of court servant to the Duke, and that's how the connection starts. And I thought it was very interesting, because by omitting that, they almost make his rise seem more meritocratic and less reliant on this sort of patronage.
Right. So on Mary of Modena, I think that was another good casting as well, because she has the actor in the series has quite a dark look to her, at least for an English woman. She doesn't actually have an accent or feign one, so it's difficult to tell when you're watching it if you weren't aware that she was actually Italian. But they do a decent job of explaining the role that she played in actually setting up John Churchill with Sarah and actually getting them basically married in the first place, because it was a little bit touch and go, shall we say. Like, there were reasons on both sides that maybe one or the other was going to get cold feet. And so, of course, she steps in and kind of plays matchmaker a little bit. And I think one of the reasons, unspoken reasons why this is because of the relationship that Sarah has with the Duke of York's children. She has a very, very good relationship with them very early on. So just for the audience's awareness, basically, as everybody knows, the Duke of York is a Catholic. He's a devout Catholic. His wife is a Catholic. And this is a ostensibly Protestant country. You've already had the Reformation period is completed. It's a fully Protestant country. And so the way that this little religious distinction and division is, resolved is the fact that both Anne and her sister are raised as Protestants and not as Catholics, right? So this becomes a huge issue, obviously, because they're the ones who eventually inherit. So it becomes a huge problem, especially for James. It's one of the more moderating things in the internal politics of England at the time, because there's the assurance that, okay, well, at least this succession, if James is still nominally a Catholic or a devout Catholic, a very, very strong Catholic in his own absolutist monarch vision, at least his children will not be. So I think that's a very moderating factor throughout the series, which kind of makes the underlying radicalism tempered.
No, certainly. And just to get onto that a bit more, because that's something, because just to set a further chronology, so there's 12 episodes in the show, and the first 4 episodes are all during Charles II's reign. His death is at the beginning of episode 5, and something that's very present in the first few episodes is that tension where Charles has got all of these sort of Anglican courtiers who are uncomfortable, because in his sort of little cabinet meetings or privy council, Charles has his brother, the Duke of York, there as part of the circle, so to speak. And all these Anglican ministers don't like the fact that there's a Catholic there, and he's saying, "Well, sorry, he's my brother. I want him there. Deal with it," basically. And
Yes, and this causes a lot of tension too, because there is a section of very very strong Protestant lords who are in the cabinet, and they always have these little cabinet meetings, and there's this gigantic tension between James and these Protestant gentlemen, and of course this issue always comes down to the fact that James is next in line for the succession. Basically, they all are trying to push the country to keep it Protestant, and they always bring up the fact that Charles I was executed, and so of course this naturally makes Charles II very very grumpy and he basically boots them out in one of these meetings because they go a step too far, and I think the tension underlying, given the radicalism and all of these little like dramatic little happenings, are very interesting to watch on the screen, certainly.
And it's also probably important in terms of the political context. It's around this time that we actually see the beginning of the modern British political factions of the Whigs and the Tories. So just to confirm, the Tories are, generally speaking, are pro-Church of England, they're pro-monarchy, whereas the Whigs they tend to support a lot of the non-conformist Protestant positions like Presbyterians, etc. And they're very pro-Parliament rather than pro-monarchy, and that's undershadowed. So the Tories tend to support Charles and James, whereas the Whigs tend to be quite critical. And it's actually one of these Whig peers, Lord Shaftesbury. He's got a little scheme where he's having these little meetings with Monmouth, who I said was Charles II's illegitimate son. And they've got a scheme where he actually goes to Charles and demands that Charles legitimize Monmouth as his heir so that he'll succeed him and not James. And Charles just says, "No, I'm not doing that." And so, again, I can understand why, on some level, why Charles wouldn't do this, because I think he was a man who's very conscious, I think, of his own sort of behaviour, and especially when he was younger. And because something that's rumoured, we're not sure if it's entirely true, but something they present as factual in the show is that when he dies, he actually has a deathbed conversion to Catholicism, which Jamie organises, and a lot of people at the time thought he was like a crypto-Catholic, which obviously, if he genuinely was that, he obviously had to keep that hidden. And some people argue that's probably explains why he was pro-French, because because he spent time in exile at the court of Louis XIV, and also because he's concerned about that, it could also explain why he refused to legitimize Monmouth, because you're thinking, "Oh no, I don't want to. I need to think about my own sort of spiritual salvation and well-being." And I think there's also very interesting, because at the same time he does also show frustration at James II's persistent sticking to being a Catholic, and he actually says to him in one episode, "Jamie, why don't you convert it and make things so much easier?" And James says, "No, I couldn't do that for my own soul." And what I love is Charles makes a comparison to French history, where you had Henri IV of France, Henri of Navarre, who was the first Bourbon king of France, because this was during the French Wars of Religion. He was a Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism in order to secure support for the French throne. And he famously once said, "Paris is worth the mass." And Charles says this to Jamie. "Jamie,
Yes.
is England not worth the Book of Common Prayer?"
Yeah, I think that's one of the more memorable lines of the series, because I was fairly struck by that scene as well. You can tell that James has a deep underlying conviction, right? And these are serious things back when people actually believed things, and especially had serious beliefs about which Christian sect was the correct one. And Obviously, this was a serious matter. This was his immortal soul, as James saw it, and to compromise on that issue would be to compromise the well being of his own soul. So it really does create a lot of tension on a personal level. You can the actor um, who plays Jamie does a very very good job at with facial expressions. I thought, especially during this scene. Um, and you can see the very pained expression when he says it too. So
Mm. No, certainly. And something else I want to just get to, because you mentioned, just go back to Sarah Churchill, just to look into how she fits into the wider picture as well, because you mentioned the relationship with the daughters of Jamie. Yes, she's very close to Princess Anne in particular, because in real life they would go on to be very fast friends. And later in the show, they have this like pet names for each other. I think Sarah calls Anne, was it Mrs. Morley, and Anne calls Sarah Mrs. Freeman, and then they speak to each other's husband. So Anne refers to Marlborough as Mr. Freeman, for example. So that shows how intimate their relationship is.
right, and it also serves as a bit of a code name too, because if letters were intercepted, right, it becomes difficult to translate who's talking to who and what's exactly being said if the names are slightly obscured. So it also is a little bit cryptic as well, and serves that purpose, I think.
No, certainly. And one other figure we've not mentioned yet is someone who's a very close friend of the Marlboroughs and a key political ally is that of Sidney Godolphin, who is in the earlier episodes, he's a politician and an MP, but later on he does become a peer and serves as a chief member of Anne's government. And he has quite a tragic early history, because there's this woman he's madly in love with. They marry. She has a son, but she dies in childbirth, and he's absolutely heartbroken.
Right,
But
and the show makes a point of the courtship process between Godolphin and his bride to be. Marlborough himself actually sets it up. He basically makes it happen. He's like a Chad playing the he, playing the wingman here. So he does it. I mean, I actually really like Godolphin. He's one of my favorite characters in the whole series, because he always is very quiet and reserved, temperamentally speaking, and but he always, when he says something, it's always quite profound. So that's one of my reasons he's my favorite. Also, he wears a green jacket, and I thought that was pretty cool. So
another touch as well is about the costumes. I think the costumes in the show are very well done, and something I like about Churchill and Godolphin is that in the earlier series, where they're a bit more modest in their status, they wear their hair naturally long, where everyone else, like Charles II, James Duke of York, all got the fashionable like long curls that were fashionable at the time, and so have all the other peers. But as you get later into the show, they themselves then get their own wigs, which again just shows you they've acquired the new high status, and eventually as it goes on, their wigs become like longer and even more elaborate. So
yes. Although there are times in the series when there are periods of relative undress, especially when Marlborough is on campaign, when he's in his campaign tent, where he's not actually wearing his wig, and so you can see that even when he's not wearing it, his hair is cropped rather short, like a modern military man's haircut. So I thought that was very interesting.
No, absolutely, and no. So further on, going from that, so we talked about how in these early episodes you've got the marriage of John and Sarah Churchill, marriage of Godolphin to his wife, and the death of his wife and the birth of his son. We've got the Charles II's conflicts with the Whigs, and then obviously, as I said, that culminates in his death at the beginning of episode 5. James comes to the throne, and now one major event in episode 5 is Monmouth's rebellion. So when Charles II dies, Monmouth tries to launch a rebellion to claim the throne for himself with the support of some of these liberal Whig peers. However, his rebellion fails because fundamentally, though people were uneasy about James's Catholicism, many people saw living memories of the Civil War and Cromwell, and most people just simply wanted stability, so they sided with James just for that reason alone. And so what ends up being quite a bit of a painful experience for Marlborough, is that he has to lead the army to defeat his former friend Monmouth, though James is still a bit uneasy about Churchill's loyalty to him. And so what he does is that he puts another man who's less capable in charge of it, where Monmouth is just serves under him.
Yeah, I
And I
think.
think,
Go ahead.
sorry, and I think we can sort of see like a beginnings of the breaking of trust between them, and just to because I think what's also interesting, because I mentioned the omission of Arabella Churchill, but there's a couple of other elements that that's actually are omitted from the show. Because there's actually a time where, due to political tensions, Charles was actually forced to send James into exile in the Netherlands, and there's actually a bit in the show where he's actually shown as away in Scotland as well, and that was just simply to keep him out of the court to lower tensions because things got that bad. But what's also interesting is something that is omitted from the show is that Churchill actually served as the Duke of York's official representative at court during his exile, which again just shows you the quite strong relationship between the two. So again, something that I said I think they've significantly played down in the show.
Yeah, it's not exactly clear how deep and intricate the loyalty was, and why. I guess you might say Marlborough's betrayal, quote unquote, of James in the Glorious Revolution, if you want to call it that, and maybe from a Jacobite perspective, but of why exactly that was a bit sudden and shocking for James on a personal level, and I lost my train of thought here. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, just to go along further from that, because it's a very interesting question of history, isn't it? James II, you have a rebellion against you by Monmouth, which is crushed, and yet 3 years later, the whole establishment support a revolution against you. How on earth did that happen? And it's simply because in the intervening years, James had, after Monmouth's rebellion, you can almost say he goes on especially how it's presented in the show, he goes on a bit of a paranoid rampage. He punishes the traitors with the bloody assizes, the trials by Judge Jeffreys, where many of them are exiled to the New World. You've also got the fact is that he's getting a lot of the peers who want to suck up to James or show loyalty. They convert to Catholicism, so that happens. His chief minister ends up doing that. You also see James starts to bring in a lot of Catholic Irish into several army officer positions because, again, he doesn't trust the English Anglicans, so he's surrounding himself with all these Catholics. And again, this is triggering a lot of suspicions of the. Sorry.
Yeah. So actually, this is what I'm remembering now better. So this is kind of where Monmouth actually, not Monmouth, sorry, where Marlborough actually gets a little bit like he's basically out of work during this period, if I'm not mistaken. Then he eventually gets put up in the Tower. Basically, he gets put up on some kind of trumped up charges.
That's actually later under William and Mary, not under James.
William and Mary. I'm sorry. Yeah. See, the later parts of the series I'm forgetting. Yeah. So, but I actually liked Monmouth's rebellion because there's several interesting like historical little things like songs that come up. Like there's especially one where Shrewsbury and the rest of the Whig faction in Parliament is basically like they're singing a song about Monmouth, and they're singing about it's like a Protestant song or something, and it goes rump thump 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 thump. It's just very catchy. So it's very funny, and I liked the depiction of Monmouth's army as being this very almost disorganized peasant mass, very poorly equipped, whereas the actual like proper army that Marlborough is commanding is actually dressed up in red coats, and he's got decent officers and horse and cannon and that sort of thing, as compared to the extremely poorly equipped infantrymen that Monmouth is commanding. So I thought that was very interesting. I also thought it was an interesting aesthetic choice to depict it as a night battle. I'm not sure if that was historically accurate or not, but I thought it made for interesting cinematography.
No, certainly. And I will say, sadly, it's, I think, one of the only 2 battle scenes we get in the whole series, because the only other one we really get is Blenheim. But then again, they're quite because obviously because these shows are done on the budget, they can't do very much. So, so there's no real like spectacular charge scenes. It's kind of you kind of just get the camera in like Monmouth's face as he's like gets a horrified expression as his men are like cut down around him. So I suppose it's quite visceral at least. And in terms of his army being depicted up, from what my understanding, that is quite accurate because he lands in the southwest where it's just quite rural and agricultural. So like all the men he can rally are just like farmers and peasants, and so that's one of the reasons it was crushed because he just did not have a professional army. And what does get mentioned in the show is that one of his main supporters is the Duke of Argyll, who's on the way south with an army. But the thing is, the ship or the fleet he's on gets struck by a storm and is like and gets forced ashore, and then they're captured, so they don't even get to meet up.
Oh, that's a historical misfortune.
No, certainly. Well, something else which we probably should discuss as an extension of this, if we're going to get onto the Glorious Revolution, which is in episode 6, is we need to talk about a character we've not mentioned that much thus far, which is William of Orange, the Stadtholder and Prince of Orange, because we first see him, I think, in one of the Charles episodes, episode 3 or 4, where he's actually married to James' elder daughter Mary, and it's really interesting because when they first meet, she's like horrified and like almost screams when she first sees him.
But he's a literal manlet, which is maybe a justifiable reaction, I guess. But he's depicted as quite short in stature, and which I think is historically accurate as well. So it's quite funny.
And also a couple of other things about him. He was also an asthmatic, and I think they show him at various points having like a bit of a coughing fit. So that was a nice touch as well.
And that was very subtle. That was very subtle. Like you wouldn't, if you didn't know that, you wouldn't be able to tell. Like you wouldn't. So.
But one other thing that's interesting is the show implies that he's a homosexual, which I actually never knew, and I had to look that up. And apparently there were rumors that he was a homosexual, and what reinforces that is, he and his wife never had any children. So, and he's also quite cold towards her. So,
yes, I mean, but he is at least an effective stat holder and a decent administrator, and at least for what I can tell from a Dutch point of view, a fairly competent military commander. I think there's an interesting scene we should bring up at this point, because he has an interaction with Marlborough fairly early on after meeting these two characters. When they initially meet, he has a conversation with Marlborough, and he's very frustrated because the English, because they're not a continental martial power, they're not a land power by any means. He's lamenting the fact that the English have a very interesting conception for their military. They don't like to have a standing army whatsoever, and so every time that war ends, as it frequently does, peace breaks out, somebody makes a peace treaty. Oh well, we put all of the officers on half pay, we get rid of all of our sailors, all of our soldiers have to go back to being laborers or whatever, and we cut our budget substantially. And of course, this is not very good because every single time that the English have to go back to war to fight with the Dutch, or on behalf with the Dutch, I should say, they have to restart their army from scratch all over again. And so Marlborough has to explain this state of affairs to a continental who is like, what are you guys doing? This doesn't make any sense. Like an army or any sort of military forces is going to decrease in effectiveness if you keep, drawing down your forces after every conflict is over. You have to have some kind of standing army. So I found that very interesting because this is a distinction that we Americans also have in the United States. It's historically not something that we prefer to do, which is to have extremely large standing armies, at least prior to the 20th century. So that's interesting to me because there's a real distinction between the Anglo conception of the world and the European conception of geopolitics.
Well, ultimately, I mean, you remember England is separated by sea, so ultimately I've got to remember as well, England, Ireland, and Scotland are all united under the same monarch, so there's no like hostile foreign powers even within the Isles, so we are far more secure. So I guess it could explain the mentality.
Sure, I mean, but this goes back to the conflicts that Charles I had with his Parliament pre-English Civil War, which is the debate over ship money, right? This there has always been this historical antagonism between executive power and parliamentary power, and parliamentary power, whatever sort of legislature you have, is always going to retain power of the purse. And so that's where these little conflicts about, okay, well, we want to go do military adventurism, but how are we going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it, etc. And so, like, I just think it's very interesting to see that as a distinction between like William of Orange and Louis the Sun King, like, where basically the prerogative of the monarch is it's totally unquestioned, right? Whatever extravagance, whatever lavishness, everything must be paid for because the monarch is the monarch, right? So I thought that was very fascinating as a contradiction and really as a contrast.
Well, one thing to bear in mind with William of Orange is obviously because the Dutch was pretty much technically a republic. It wasn't a monarchy, but he does have almost monarch-like
Right.
powers considering his political position as the
Right.
stadtholder of the majority of the provinces and as the Prince of Orange. However, I'd also argue, being the Netherlands are quite small, they're surrounded by hostile Catholic powers because remember, the Spanish still control the southern Netherlands or Belgium, and then you've got the French as well. So it makes sense that they have to have a strong professional landed army to see off these threats. So it completely makes sense from his perspective. But something I just want to get back into, because I think the portrayal of him in the show as his sort of shrewd, cunning, political operator, I thought was very interesting, because I'm used to this portrayal of William of Orange, especially in British history, that he's this sort of Protestant champion who liberated us from the tyrant James II, and he challenged and was the arch nemesis of Louis the Sun King. And it's interesting, they don't really go with that. They go with it more that he's this sort of opportunist who is exploiting England to serve his own benefit. So ultimately, and what I really like, there's a scene where Monmouth is in exile and he meets with Mary and William, and Monmouth sort of asks him directly, will you not support me when Charles dies to help me become king? And William of Orange is kind of like very reluctant, and he's like, I don't think that's a good idea. It's probably a bit reckless. And Monmouth, I think, kind of implies that he's like a coward. And then when he storms out, William and Mary have a conversation, and it's essentially implied that they kind of have their own potential ambitions for the throne, which is so they don't support Monmouth because, well, no, we want the throne for ourselves. We're not going to support you. So if anything, Monmouth ended up being probably the useful idiot for those two.
Mm. Yeah, they definitely make William seem extremely opportunist for sure. Very shrewd character.
Mm. And so to get on with the Glorious Revolution, so I mentioned the bloody assizes with Judge Jeffreys. You've also got you've got all the obviously Catholic officers, and we've lost Mandrill. Hopefully he'll be back shortly. So other than the Catholic officers and the Irish coming in, James also starts to tamper with the government and organisation of the Church of England. So he actually annoys a lot of the clergy, and there's a trial of 7 bishops who he tries to condemn for seditious libel, and they end up getting let off, and James is not very happy about this either. And ultimately, the straw that really breaks the camel's back is to reinforce his position in England. James then wants to bring in an army of Catholic Irish from Ireland, and this has echoes of something that happened, almost triggered the first of the civil wars back in the 1640s, where again his father Charles I also wanted to bring an army of Catholic Irish into England, and this set off the concerns of the Protestant subjects. So Glorious Revolution kicks off, and ultimately the reason it's so clean is because pretty much so much of the elite go over to William because they are just so sick of James at that point. And something to really look at about why Marlborough defects is that, again, he does not want to be on the losing side, and he sees where the wind is blowing. So he could either stay loyal to James, in which case there might have actually been a civil war, which would have devastated the country, and he may have been on the losing side, or he can go over and support William of Orange, and then ultimately, as would happen, prove completely victorious and be rewarded for his service. Yeah, so Mandrill's just told me his internet's cut out, so hopefully he should be back with us any moment. So of course, when James is deposed, and we now have the William and Mary are crowned, they become the king and queen. And in these sort of episodes after this, as we're getting into the midpoint of the series, there then starts to be tension, where essentially William does not prove to be as beneficent with England, because essentially he starts bringing in his own like Dutch soldiers and Dutch officers to garrison England and to serve him at court. So again, all the English are being shoved out and the Dutch are being brought in. And there's a moment where kind of Marlborough, Godolphin, and other peers are all at, I think they're at like a coffee house, and they're all kind of like talking about, we've made this revolution, we'll bring the king over to our side. He can't sort of govern without us. And something that ends up happening is, as Mandrill did mention earlier, is there's a moment in the show where Monmouth is actually locked up, and not Monmouth, sorry, Marlborough is locked up and put in the Tower of London. And this is because, in real history, he was accused of having Jacobite sympathies and trying to bring James back to power. In the show, it's more presented that he's not a sincere Jacobite. He just simply is trying to present himself as a Jacobite, but it's more to present a counter threat to William, to try and get William to climb down from some of his positions that are alienating the English. And so he goes to the Tower of London on these trumped up charges, and eventually he's found innocent and is released. And something else that also overshadows this period is the friendship between Sarah Churchill and Anne is blossoming and becoming stronger. At this point, Anne has actually married her husband, Prince George of Denmark, and there's a lot of personal tragedy. And welcome back.
I don't know what had just happened there. That was extremely frustrating. I heard a little bit about what you were talking about. You were discussing Marlborough's interaction after he gets thrown in prison.
So just quickly go back to the Glorious Revolution. So ultimately, I think in the show it's presented very sympathetically that he's almost being shown as I've got no choice. Because they actually talk about it. There's a moment where there's a meeting where like it's all the peers. So there's Marlborough there, Godolphin's there, the Duke of Buckingham's there, who was one of Charles's chief ministers. Laurie Hyde's the Earl of Rochester's there, and they're all arguing. And some of them are saying we've got to support William and get rid of James, and some are saying no, we can't cause a civil war. But ultimately, it ends up all being too much, and Marlborough goes over because he ultimately feels like he's got no choice because James has just gone too far. But if I'm going to be a little bit more cynical, I personally think that Marlborough, because something that's very important to remember is a lot of his early career, he was very much dependent on James for patronage and influence. But by this point, for the last couple of years, since at least the early 1680s, Marlborough has actually been distancing himself from James and instead relying more on what's called the cockpit circle, which is this courtship of court of influence around Princess Anne. So it's obviously the Churchills, Godolphin, Anne's husband, Prince George of Denmark, and those who are sympathetic to them. And so this is what he's using to kind of essentially build like a rival castle. And what he sort of you could almost say is that when it comes along, any kind of loyalty or sentiment to James has been worn down, and he just thinks, well, I'm not going to risk fighting a civil war for a king I've got no faith or loyalty in, and I'll probably be in a worse position.
Right, and of course, the memory of his family history probably was coming to the fore here. He realized that he needed to back the winning side, and this is what politics is. It's a question of what have you done for me lately, and all of the previous patronage that James had given to Marlborough, that's all gone out the window, right? That's all old hat. So by this point, he's got essentially a new patron, and due to his wife's relationship with Anne.
No, and what's also interesting is there is a scene where Sarah Churchill's sort of fleeing the court, to go over to William, and there's an encounter between her and Mary Modena, because remember, Sarah Churchill had been the sort of maid of honour for the Duchess of York, now the Queen, and there was a real tension where Mary she's obviously hurt that someone that she's patronised and given her support to, and who she even helped organise and facilitate her marriage, is now betraying her. So she's clearly hurt, understandably, but she also understands why Sarah kind of feels the way that she does, and just has to accept the parting of their company.
Mm. Yeah.
It's just certainly sad. And also something else I did forget to mention, sorry, I'm being a bit scatterbrained tonight, is the ultimate catalyst for why the Gauze Revolution happened, despite everything else we mentioned, is the fact that Mary Modena allegedly gives birth to a son who they're going to raise as Catholic, and now the prospect of a Catholic heir is what is the tipping point for why it happens. But what's interesting is the show plays with this historical rumor where allegedly, essentially, it's kind of, there's this idea that Mary had a bit of a phantom pregnancy, a bit like a Mary I of England, and she wasn't actually pregnant, and that some like random child was smuggled into the royal bedroom in a warming pan, and so that's something they put in the show. Like, a warming pan is brought into the room while there's lots of guests there waiting to see the newborn baby, and it's that event is enough to cast aspersions. So not only is this going to be a Catholic heir, the Catholic heir is not even potentially legitimate, and so this is an absolute bombshell, and is ultimately the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Right. I think it's important to note the importance of gossip in this period. Like, you can kind of, I don't know, the role of gossip. You can kind of see a bit of this also with the whole Titus Oates affair. Essentially, like, a lot of this stuff has, at least the way that the show portrays it, there's not really any actual basis to it. It seems like it's almost counterfactual. Um, uh, so I don't know. Maybe there's a bit of a residual Catholic bias in the show, but I just thought that was very interesting, because every single time that one of these little, like, rumor things comes up of, Titus Oates or this particular incident, like, it always happens to go the Protestant way, doesn't it?
Certainly, and just to clarify, the Titus Oates affair was an alleged plot by Catholics to assassinate Charles to make sure James became the king, and that was foiled and proven to be false. And I think ultimately that was very clearly in the Protestants' favour, to try and sow dissension and to hopefully get Charles to renounce James as heir, but that doesn't work out that way. And just to go back to this whole incident with the Catholic heir being born, James Francis Edward Stuart, I think in isolation, the birth and the rumour, I don't think were lethal to James, but in combination with everything else we've discussed, the treatment of Monmouth's rebellion, the alienation of many of the Anglican subjects, the trial of the bishops, the bringing in of the Catholic Irish, all these things together is just made like a deadly cocktail that led to his deposition.
Right. It's one of these interesting, just to do, like, historical comparisons. It's like his James's father, basically. It's like Charles the First, who you try to do a little bit too much, and like, it doesn't work, because you're pushing too hard in one direction, and the country is already well beyond you. I mean, like, I don't like the conversation about Overton window or anything, but it's just understanding that politics is the art of the possible, and being able to take the temperature and reading the room, I guess, is a talent that the Stewart family doesn't really seem to possess. They'll have this reputation, and I think it's well justified, for being a bit zealous in their own strange way, or at least.
No, that's certainly true, and it's just fascinating, because you have Charles I who has this problem. Charles II comes in, and knowing everything that he knows and what he's lived through, he's much more cautious, and it's just interesting that the brother James just is not as cautious, and so on some level, you could possibly blame Charles for not having a legitimate heir, because if he'd had a legitimate heir that was Protestant, then that would have solved the problem pretty much.
Right, and it's not that he lacked fecundity at all. He had plenty of illegitimate children, so it's just a question of having a legitimate child with the one woman that he should have done.
Mm, yeah, but perhaps a bit self-indulgent, Charles. But yeah. So okay, so we have the Glorious Revolution. James is deposed. So we've been calling him Marlborough, but I think it's only after the Glorious Revolution he's actually given the title the Earl of Marlborough. As beforehand, I think he'd been a baron, so it was a minor peerage, but beforehand being a gentleman. So now is the Earl of Marlborough, and obviously now all of these Whig peers are now in favourable positions with the new king. However, I said it's not all smooth sailing because there's a very strong tension between Queen Mary and her sister Anne, especially over what kind of income is Anne going to be allowed. And essentially, many sympathetic peers in Parliament want to give her this income, but Mary wants to veto it. And there's a whole scheme where the Earl of Shrewsbury meets Sarah Churchill in like the Palace Gardens, and Sarah Churchill sticks by her friend Anne and says, "No, we're not going to like undermine her." So that also carries on for the next couple of episodes. This is about the midpoint of the series, about episodes sort of 7 through 9 is William and Mary's reign, and also something else that happens is there's a lot of personal tragedies because Anne and her husband George, there's a scene where episode where George gets quite sick, and what's really tragic is um, one of their children has actually died, and Anne can't bring herself to tell him while he's recovering from a terrible illness that their child's died. And there's a moment where Sarah's like says to her, "You've got to tell him," and she has to go back in again, and off screen, obviously tells him what happens. And then there's another episode where I think another child of theirs dies because Anne and her husband, I think, have like something silly like 10 children, and none of them reach adulthood. And even more tragic later on, you've got her son. I think it was Prince George. He actually, I think, reached the age of I think 11 or 12 before dying.
Mm. Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say on this part of the series. It's other than you can clearly see that whilst the reign of William and Mary is firmly in place, that the alliance between um, uh, Mrs. Freeman and Mrs. Morley was being greatly solidified. I think that was what I took away from those episodes the most. Is that there's now this political alliance that's been greatly cemented by a demonstration of deep personal loyalty. Um, so
No, certainly, and it's interesting because it almost plays into so because Sarah has a good relationship with Anne, she has a bad relationship with Mary, and Mary even orders Anne to break off her relationship with Sarah Churchill, which she refuses to do, and this ends up bleeding through into the relationship where now William, who's the king, he needs sort of Marlborough to an extent because he's a competent military officer and he's got the support of the army, but at the same time, one thing I find really interesting is in the show, a lot of these peers who, there's a scene where it's in like a coffee house and Godolphin sort of boasts and says, William can't ignore us. We're the ones who made the revolution. We made the king. He kind of owes us. We can just make another king if we need to. And so it's kind of being, a bit openly seditious. And there's a moment as well where Churchill openly says, we need to, rally support for James and the Jacobites. And what's interesting is in the show, it's all presented as he's not being sincere when he says this. He's saying this, I think, just to scare, I think, William into not being so paranoid about, not relying on the English and relying on all these Dutchmen at courts and in the army. And whereas from what I'm reading in my own research, it seems to be that this was gossip or rumor that Marlborough was Jacobite. And again, this whole connection with him and James, being James's former page, being James' personal representative in the past, the fact his sister was James's mistress, this all fuels the fire around these rumors about him being secretly a Jacobite. And you could also even say that, you could even make an argument that Marlborough's thinking, we got rid of James to just bring in William, and William's just doing some of the same mistakes and alienating me and other Englishmen like James is doing. We might as well just stuck with James. You could even make that argument. And so I have to wonder if there's any truth to these rumors.
well, yeah, I think the show does a good job at making these seem like they're more insubstantial than rumors, or more substantial than rumors, I should say. Um, and the way that they do this is literally after Marlborough makes this comment about James, there's a Jacobite agent who is like sitting across the room or like staring at them like with, beneath a dark broad brimmed hat or something, and he walks over and introduces himself, and I think Godolphin is like, oh, that was a Jacobite agent, like, oh, you literally, you know speak of James and he shall appear almost.
It's 17th century glowy, so it's all you need, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, no, and there's a whole scheme where like there's this guy who's like in prison who's connected to the Jacobites, and there's this if you go to this man's house, there's like a note in the flower vase that says oh yes, Marlborough's complicit in this Jacobite plot, and then he's brought before Mary, and it's like, oh no, actually it's not there, it's all made up. And so eventually, there's a moment of tension where Marlborough's in the tower and Sarah's really fearful for him, and Anne is trying to beseech her sister to help get him out, and then eventually he's freed. And it's actually around this time in episode 9, I think, so episode 8, Mary actually dies quite suddenly of an illness, and her death is what allows the healing of the rift between the Marlboroughs, Anne and William, because Mary, the problematic character, is now dead. And what's interesting, at the beginning of episode 9, there's this little meeting between William and Anne where he says, listen, you or I don't like each other. However, you're my heir. I don't have any legitimate children. You will succeed me. And so we've got to make a public face of stability and being prepared to work together. And something we've actually forgotten to neglect to mention is after the Glorious Revolution, obviously it wasn't all quite as bloodless as we make it out. It did lead to, there was some clans in Scotland rebelled, which was crushed. That was the Massacre of Glencoe. But more significantly, in Ireland, which was predominantly Catholic, James II was actually able to rally an army with aid from the French. And this,
famously the Battle of the Boyne,
Battle of the Boyne, which is talked about, but you never actually see it. It's entirely off screen, because what's also interesting with that is that William leads that in person. He does, and again, he's not trusting Marlborough to lead this army to Ireland because, Marlborough's got these connections to James. Who say he's not just going to defect over to James? I think that's something that's under the surface.
Right, very much under the surface. I almost wish they had made a bigger point of that, but that might have made the show run a little long in order to explain all of that. But it's not exactly clear why, at least in terms of the personal loyalty previously with Marlborough, like they don't actually explicitly go into why William dislikes him or why there's a perception of disloyalty, and the reason is because of the previous connection that Marlborough has with James. Like I wish they had extrapolated on that a little bit more, honestly.
Yeah, I think one issue I would have with this show is, I think it's a problem with some of these older shows, and AM pointed this out with Fall of Eagles when he reviewed it. A lot of these shows, I think, are assuming the general public are well informed of history and assume they know everything. And so they assume, if we leave a gap, that's fine. The public will just fill it in for us. But the thing is, most people just are not experts on this period. They don't know everything. And even though it was 1969 when the show was released, and I like to think the general public back then were a bit better informed than they are now, I still just don't think that a normie in 1969, even maybe an upper class or a middle class normie, the kind of audience I think the show is aimed at, would necessarily know everything about 17th century restoration politics to be able to fill in all these gaps.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not.
Yes, and yes, and so going back to the why there's this bad relationship between the Marlboroughs, again, it's their relationship to Anne. Anne's got a bad relationship with her sister, and something that's implied is that Mary. What's really interesting, because despite their first meeting, Mary actually really loves William and is very loyal to him, but that relationship is not reciprocated back. William does not love Mary, regardless of whether you believe he's homosexual or not. There's no love for her there, but he kind of feels guilty, I think, and so he's trying to show loyalty to her in what way he can. And so because she wants to hurt her sister, she wants the Marlboroughs ruined, and so I think William when he hears these sort of rumours that Marlborough's a Jacobite agent, I think he plays into it because he wants to please his wife ultimately.
Mm. Yeah, I have no opinion on that, honestly.
Well, I think it's certainly a possibility. It's not an absolute truth.
Certainly
But
entertaining to think about.
no, absolutely. And so, yeah, so just, so we mentioned about other points. The reason I'm mentioning that is it's around this time that because we obviously we'll get into this War of Spanish Succession shortly, but before that conflict, there was another very long conflict in Europe between the same coalition called the 9 Years' War, or the War of the Grand Alliance, and it starts in 1688, and it's kicked off because William of Orange was this nemesis to Louis XIV. You've got to think about it. England had been allied with France against the Netherlands throughout Charles II's reign. Now suddenly that's flipped. England is now pro-Dutch and not pro-France. And so you've now got this alliance of the three kingdoms and the Dutch under William, and then you've got the Habsburgs under Emperor Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor. And obviously at this time, you've also got Spain as well, which is still under Habsburg rule with Charles II. But obviously he's going to be on the way out soon. And so you've got the War of the Grand Alliance is essentially this coalition of these three powers, this Anglo-Dutch faction and the Habsburg faction, trying to contain the ambitions of Louis XIV. And this starts from 1688 until 1697. And obviously Churchill doesn't play much of a role in this because he's mostly dealing with political troubles on the home front, and it's mostly William who is leading armies in the field in the Netherlands, and mostly in the Spanish Netherlands against Louis. And yes, we don't really see much of that war, but I think it's something that's in the background, and it possibly could also explain why William might be a bit wary about Churchill, because what he doesn't want is, while he's on campaign in the continent, that suddenly there's like a coup at home that restores James to power again.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the big concerns of any new monarch is internal dissension.
But of course, I think once Mary dies, I think things do significantly cool and do get better and more stable. And he's actually able, because there's a moment where he has a meeting with Marlborough when the Treaty of Ryswick is signed, which is 1697, that ends the War of the Grand Alliance. And they actually talk about the issue of the Spanish succession, and William just says to Marlborough, though we just signed peace, I can't see this peace lasting very long, because unless we can come to an adequate agreement over who's going to succeed Charles II as King of Spain, there will be another war. And he obviously lays out the three candidates. You've got Philip, the grandson of Louis XIV. You've got Charles, the younger son of Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor, or you've got the Bavarian prince, whose name I'm forgetting. Who was kind of seen as like a compromise candidate. But obviously, what happens shortly afterwards is that Bavarian prince unfortunately dies, and then ultimately Charles II of Spain decides to make Philip, the grandson of Louis XIV, his heir. And obviously, because he's a grandson, essentially Louis XIV has his elder son. I think it was Louis the Grand Dauphin, the Crown Prince, and then he himself had two sons, and Philip was the younger son of the Grand Dauphin. So even though he wasn't in the direct line of succession, because obviously he had an older brother and his own father, because he was still a direct descendant of the Sun King, he was still seen as, I think, too close to the potential line of succession, that it made the opposing faction wary, which is why we then get the War of Spanish Succession that does kick off in 1701. And this is the final year of William's reign, because he dies in 1702, and then Anne comes to the throne, and the rest of the series, the last sort of 3 episodes, are Anne's reign. And here we see the Marlboroughs at the absolute zenith of their power, because Anne decides to make Marlborough the Captain General of the Anglo-Dutch forces. And the reason she does this is because now William's dead, there's no longer a personal union between England and the Netherlands, and so using England's position as the larger power with the larger army, and she is able to get the Dutch to agree to make Marlborough the Captain General for the Anglo-Dutch forces. So he's the ultimate commander-in-chief for England and the Netherlands. So the Dutch are a bit wary about this, understandably. And to sort of give a good example, this is a bit like when in World War II, Eisenhower was made the the Grand Allied commander for both the Brits and Americans. He's sort of like a commander in chief. The only faction he's obviously not in control of is obviously the Habsburg faction, which is under the control of Eugene of Savoy, who's the other sort of great generalissimo of this period. And so this really represents as at the height of Marlborough's power, that he's now got essentially the commander of the English forces and the Dutch forces. And met at this time his wife Sarah. She is now made the maid of honor and the keeper of the keys and seals for Anne, who's now the queen. So she herself is also in an unrivaled domestic position. And what's also worth discussing is Anne also makes Godolphin her chief minister. He's her treasury minister, but I think she also makes him her chief minister overall. So, so it's just interesting that in the early part of the show, the cockpit circle, Queen Anne, she's kind of like this she's younger princess of the Duke of York, and she's just got a circle of friends around her. But over time, they've been able to stick by her and cement their influence, and now they're the ones running the show, so to speak. So, any sort of comments you want to make off that at all, or?
Yeah, well, first of all, like, of course, I've mentioned earlier that Godolphin was one of my favorite characters, and I think he gets a staff, I think, which I think is I can't remember his exact position title. He's not Chancellor of the Exchequer, is he? Is that what you guys call it? I think that's what it is.
I think it's actually the Lord Treasurer is
the Lord Treasurer. Yes, but he has a little like wand, wooden staff thingamajig that he's always carrying around with him, and I just thought that was really awesome, because it's like you see it with him in every single scene that he appears with in after that point. And of course, at the very end of the series, he when they actually finally fall out with Anne, prior to her death, he basically has to like snap it in half, like at home, and then chucks it in his own fireplace. Which I always thought was like deeply symbolic of the broken relationship at that point. So, and it's really.
It was interesting because from what I remember, I think he's reading the letter from Anne, basically saying he's fired, and
yeah,
she said, "Don't bother returning your staff of office," and he's like, "Fine then," and he just pulls up his knee and snaps it and throws it in the fire. So he sort of has that. That's how I'll dispose of it then if you don't want it back. So.
Right. Which I thought was kind of Chad, but anyway, I liked the last section mostly because it deals more with military affairs as well. Because this is the height of Marlborough's military power and his prowess. Like he's fairly old by this point, if I'm not mistaken. In history, he would have been like a very, very old man.
Well, he would have been 52 when the War Spanish Succession started, and so,
right.
And he would have been, we would have been in his mid 60s when the war ended, and he died at the age of 72 in 1722. And what's interesting is Sarah, I mentioned she was about 10 years younger than him. She actually outlives him by several years. She dies in the 1740s when she's like 85 or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very long lifespan for the time. But I liked this section for Marlborough because he actually does a lot of explaining in terms of like military tactics and that sort of thing. So like that was very interesting to see these little anachronisms of how you actually explain how things are done. Like for example, he's teaching his son and some of the princes.
Oh yes, there's that scene. Yeah, it's like Anne's son, Prince George, is with Marlborough's son, also called John. They're in the garden, and you just hear them going fire, and they're like doing like a test cannon shots, and they're like doing military. that Marlborough's showing them how to do military drill, and then they come inside, and it's like let me show you a diagram. This is how you cross a river with like a sentry, and it's I like that.
Yes.
Bit.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite and most memorable bits of the series. It's actually interesting how you do that. I also thought it was funny because what was his name? George of Denmark. and Anne's husband, he's like, I can't make sense of it. He's like this buffoonish, side piece husband who doesn't really do a whole lot. He's always very fat. So I thought that was a really funny um, uh, exploration of his character. Um, yeah, as far as Marlborough goes, I like the bit where he's drawing up his battle plan in the Netherlands, and he's like, okay, well, here's how we're going to take all of these fortresses, and as long as you have this fortress over here, you can take this one, then that one, and that one, right? And that they're all going to fall in a sequence, basically. And later, of course, when the alliance falls apart, they lose most of it again, and so they have to reconquer all of these same fortresses over again. So I just thought that was a very interesting little classification of siege warfare in the Netherlands. It's like, oh, you know, you you have to take the ground over twice, you know.
From what I remember, I think it's because what happens when Charles II, I think, if Spain decides to make that's what happens at the beginning of the war in 1701, because Spain is now led by Philip V, who's Louis the Grand's grandson. The Dutch had permission from the Spanish to put garrisons in all these fortresses in the Spanish Netherlands, and as soon as the war starts, they all kicked out, and William's furious because they've now lost this position.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so just to go back to the court, so because something else we've got to mention is the Marlboroughs do actually cement their alliance and friendship with Godolphin, because their oldest daughter, Henrietta, marries Godolphin's son.
Yes, and this is foreshadowed earlier on in the series too, because they basically make this pact after the births of both of their children, and it's not really like cemented in stone or anything, but they definitely foreshadow it. So I thought that was very interesting that this was, whether that actually happened historically. I thought that was fascinating that the show would depict it as if it was.
No, from what I read, they did actually marry. The daughter did marry Godolphin's son, and what's also interesting is their younger daughter Anne, which obviously named after the Queen, marries the son of the Earl of Sunderland, and that proves to be a bit of contention between Sarah and Anne when their friendship starts to break down, because I've mentioned the Whigs and Tories. Anne is abashedly pro-Tory and doesn't like Whigs at all, and when we see the breakdown in the relationship towards the last couple of episodes, now what's very interesting is if you look at the historiography around Queen Anne Mandrill, it's actually very negative, and the reason it's so negative is the main sort of primary historical source we have is Sarah Churchill's memoirs, and in those memoirs she absolutely destroys Anne, and she absolutely slates her reputation, and this is why it's been so negative. And it's only really since the 1980s we've had a more balanced representation of Anne's reign. And
there's obvious reasons for that, because as we mentioned before, this betrayal that happens between Anne and Sarah is quite a deep betrayal, really. So I think that's probably something we should explain too, because it's impossible to understand the ending part of the series without it. Basically, you have this more Tory faction that Anne basically comes towards, and essentially this means that the Churchills are you can tell that they're already a bit politically on thin ice. There's an interesting little bit where Marlborough is wandering around and he's giving briefings to the Queen in cabinet, and he basically is confronted with this new faction who is now closer to the Queen, and he has a former ally who's a bit of a turncoat himself, and he basically says, "Oh, you keep strange friends these days." And this is a guy who had been with them in this little circle club or whatever they're calling it, and he'd been with them basically from the beginning, and so now he's shifted back over toward the winning faction. And so now he's confronted with the fact that this guy who he's known for years and who's been in these areas for years and been a decent friend to them, and all of a sudden now, oh, you so I thought that was very interesting.
No, certainly. And just a comment, our good friend Hunger in the chat, do I have map autism if I need maps to visualize all of this? I suppose you do. I mean, I've got a map I can bring up if people want some visualization. One moment. Yeah, so this is Europe at the time. So there's France. Spain is allied to France. So it's France and Spain versus the Three Kingdoms, which would also something that's also interesting. Mandrill is there's no mention of the Act of Union because the Kingdom of Great Britain was actually formed in 1707 during Anne's reign, and there's no mention of it. I guess it's not exactly consequential to Churchill's story, so it's kind of understandable. But it's interesting that it was completely omitted. So you've got the British, the Dutch, and then the HRE. Yeah,
it's almost like from a monarch's perspective, the Kingdom of Britain already existed prior to the Act of Union, so it's almost like an afterthought, right? I would imagine that if it was omitted, that was probably a reason why. It's not even it's like legitimating what already exists basically and putting it on paper.
I know that's a fair point, and so so to go back to the actual breakdown, so it's important. So why does it break down? So in the show, they present it as, well, there's an election towards the latter years of Anne's reign, and this election results in more Whigs coming into Parliament, and the Whigs are really unhappy with Anne's policies, and they want a stake in the government. And so Sarah's presented as being very pragmatic and going, "Oh, come on, Mrs. Morley, you must appoint Whigs to your government. I know you don't like them, but you've got to be pragmatic, otherwise the Whigs, because they control a large portion of Parliament, they're just going to keep undermining your policies and not voting to give you revenue. And so you've got to be practical." And Anne is just shown as being very unreasonable and actually quite pig-headed and go, "No, I'll only work with Tories. I only people I like, and the only people who I'll listen to." And
very Stuart tendency coming out in her old age. Yeah, very strange.
No, and another point as well is, though, from what I'm reading, there's also obviously a more, shall we say, personally ambitious angle to why Sarah would want to appoint Whigs, because the person she specifically suggests is, you need to appoint the Earl of Sunderland to your ministry. Now, why does she say that? Well, the Earl of Sunderland happens to be her son-in-law, married to her younger daughter Anne, so there is a personal gain. Obviously, she'll have someone else who is a member of her immediate family in the government. Obviously, who's obviously going to be loyal to her and who she can work with. So you can understand why Anne may not want to put too many people who are only loyal to the Marlboroughs in her administration. So again, an aspect of the show that I think it might be a little bit unfair towards Anne.
Perhaps. I mean, obviously, this show is probably using Sarah's memoirs fairly heavily as a source because it came out prior to the 1980s. But the depiction of this deep betrayal between Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman is one that's fairly heart-wrenching for Sarah, and it's depicted as being extremely fraught, emotionally speaking. And it almost seems rather heartless on the part of the Queen. Like the way it's depicted is very, very cold. Like, oh, well, you said you didn't want an answer, so I'm not going to give you one. It's like, wow. I mean, that was probably the one of the last one of the last more memorable moments of the series, I think.
Yes, and so just to lean more into that, so something else we've not mentioned is earlier in the show, because something Sarah does is that she's got a cousin, I think, I'm trying to remember her name, it's something like Annabelle Jennings or something, and who she brings in to Anne's court, because obviously she's not got a job and she's quite down on her luck, and I'm going to do my cousin a favour and bring her in as another maid to the Queen. And so and Anne agrees to do this as a favour to Sarah, and so Sarah's cousin's now also serving with her, the Queen. What ends up happening is there's a little intrigue going on where you've got these other peers and politicians who they're presented as being pro-Jacobite and they're Tories, and what they want to do is they realise that Anne is favourably disposed towards the Tories. So what they do is they kind of capture Sarah's cousin and get her to be part of their little scheme to essentially drive a wedge between the Marlboroughs and Anne. And so this little cousin May starts whispering, these little plots and schemes and organising these meetings between these Tory ministers and Anne in private, without Sarah's knowledge. And something that's a particular betrayal is they actually end up getting one of these peers to marry the maid, the cousin, and this is something that really hurts Sarah because Sarah's not notified that she was getting married, and she was like the last one to know, and she's deeply upset and betrayed when this does happen. And when the relationship gets so bad, it does result in just Sarah and Anne just sending letters to each other. And you're right. And then finally, where Sarah's like, I must confront her because I can't believe she's treating me this way after all these years of service and loyalty, that she kind of goes into the royal apartment and lets her in, and Anne just stands there. And what's something else that's important to mention for why I think Anne might be the way she's like this in the scene is that shortly before this, her husband, Prince George, dies. And so she's obviously really distraught now because the rock in which she'd relied on for support, other than the Churchills, has now gone from her. And she's actually in like a mourning dress. She's all in black when there's the last meeting between Sarah and Anne. And something I thought was really interesting. Now, I'm not sure how accurate the portrayal of Anne in this scene is, but maybe it's based on Sarah Churchill's memoirs. But I can't help but with Anne post the death of her husband, I get very strong Queen Victoria vibes post the death of Prince Albert. It's very, we are not amused, and she's just very stern and stubborn, because that's that portrayal we see of Queen Victoria, that she's becomes this like middle-aged cow that there's like no joy or life in her. It almost seems like Anne is like an 18th century early equivalent of Queen Victoria in this scene.
Oh, that's an interesting connection to make. I didn't notice that when I first watched it. But again, you're an Englishman and I'm not, so that's a fascinating observation, I think.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering whether they're like thinking, or let's give her like a Queen Victoria death of Albert vibe, essentially. They're both women, they're both in mourning. It works, And and I think it's a very heart-wrenching scene because Sarah ends up leaving in tears ultimately. And then once that happening, is Anne writes to Sarah and tells her to hand over like all of her like positions, and she gives them to her cousin who's now supplanted her. So Sarah's now suffered this deep personal betrayal, not only by a cousin but also by Anne herself.
Yeah, by her best friend, her lifelong friend at this point.
And of course, then while this is all going on, she's having disagreements with Godolphin, because Godolphin backs up Sarah and saying, no, you must put Whigs in your government. What doesn't help is that I mentioned Sarah's son-in-law, the Earl of Sunderland. Well, Sunderland was actually quite a radical Whig, because there's actually a scene where he's with his wife, Anne, and the Churchills, and he says something basically almost treasonous. He says something like, oh, like sod the monarchy or something. So he's basically a Republican behind closed doors. And this is obviously, you can understand why Anne wouldn't be happy with having someone like this in her government. And so just a point in her favor, I would say. And ultimately, because Godolphin backs up the Churchills and said, look, come on, you must put him in the government. And in the end, that's what leads to her giving him the sack. And from there, despite this all going on, she has to keep Marlborough Churchill as the commander-in-chief of the army, because the war is still going on. And he's won so much glory and prestige from all these battles. He wins Battle of Blenheim, which is the only other battle we really get to see in the show, other than Sedgemoor. And obviously you've got other ones. You've got Ramillies and Malplaquet, and he's winning all these victories. And also forgot to mention, something she does honour him with is she finally makes him the Duke of Marlborough, because he's going to be treating with his sort of main commander, Eugene of Savoy. There's this argument, well, we can't have him being an earl. He's too lowly to treat with a prince. We must make him a duke to, really give him enough splendor and prestige to treat with, Generalissimo Eugene of Savoy. And so she's forced. So we can see that she's not entirely impractical. She's sensible enough to know that she's got to win this war, and so she can't just, even though she's got a bad relationship with Sarah and Godolphin, she can't kick Marlborough out. And there's even moments where she has meetings with Marlborough and he's backing up, obviously, his wife and Godolphin. And she's clearly, like, there's a part of her that really just wants to sack him, but she can't.
Right. And you can see that the relationship Marlborough with Anne fraying pretty much along the same time, as like after his wife has her betrayal. So he's got like this weird um, like tension later in the series with somebody he previously had a great deal of affection for, and had reciprocated affection. So it's very strange to see that like a coldness begin to set in the later episodes.
And what ends up happening is, so at the episode 11, I think we kind of have an idea really of the Churchills and Godolphin. And in the final episode, the War of Succession comes to an end. So Churchill is now finally relieved of his military command, and these Tories around her appear to be triumphant and ascendant. But what goes wrong is one of the peers who was kind of helping sort of scheme Anne into this new government of just Tories and getting rid of the Marlboroughs. He finds out that one of the other guys, this sort of peer called St. John, he's actually openly pro-Jacobite, and so he felt he was being duped. And it's like, and in the cabinet, it's the moment in the cabinet meeting where she gets this new government after she just sacked Marlborough, and he suddenly realizes, because the St. John guy just says straight away, right, well, we need to discuss the succession. I think we need to bring, your half brother James back as the heir. And she says, Anne says, yes, I agree. And the other guy's like, what? You're a Jacobite. This is outrageous. And then Anne goes ballistic at him. And then there's an argument, and then the government collapses. And the first meeting of this new government she signs just completely falls apart within a moment, and all the peers just storm out.
Oh yeah, that was a great scene too. I mean, but it just goes to show you, like, never trust Tories. They're always up to something.
No, deeply subversive. But that's something that was true. Anne did favour her own half brother, and I can kind of see this because there's an argument that it's shown earlier in the show that when James II is deposed after the Glorious Revolution, James does write to both his daughters, Mary and Anne, sort of cursing them for their treason, and Anne does feel shaken by her father's accusation, and she can't shake that she has done something wrong by not siding with her father. And I have to wonder if that's what haunts her and what makes her decide, actually, I want my half brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, the old pretender, to succeed me. But it's almost like I'm righting some wrong of the succession if I allow him to come back, and even though he's a Catholic. And what's interesting, because at this time, the Whigs in Parliament had actually been able to formalise the Protestant succession, whereby George, the Elector of Hanover, was going to be the successor to the throne because he was the next closest Protestant relation to Anne. And she actually refused to allow them to come to Britain to even meet with her or meet with any government officials, which is just shows you the succession wasn't quite clear cut. So I have to wonder if Anne had just lived a bit longer and had been able to shore up her position with the Tories more, whether they could have accomplished the restoration of James Francis Stuart. Because they've actually done so, it would have ensured the Stuart dynasty would have carried on ruling England or Britain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting hypothetical. I don't know.
I know it's certainly something interesting to think about. And so it ends with Anne dying, sort of ill, alone, being undermined. She's lost all her friends, and then all the peers are drawing up, and she finally consents to George of Hanover being made her heir. And while this is going on during the last couple of episodes, there are some scenes where you see Sarah is off with like an architect, looking at the designs for building Blenheim Palace, which is going to be the Marlborough's new stately home. And there's issues where like there's not enough funds they can get to keep the project going. And Sarah's like, no, we must finish it. And the architect's like, but I haven't got the funds. Well, release the funds from the Crown. I'm sure it won't be a problem. And then obviously as the relationship breaks down with Anne, funds start becoming an issue. But at the very end, we kind of see them in like their kind of old age, triumph. Marlborough's, the war's just ended. Marlborough's come back. He's like, he's retired now from the army. Sarah's no longer the obviously maid and advisor to Anne, and they are sort of comfort to kind of just retire at Blenheim Palace and kind of just ride off into the sunset essentially when you get that closing scene.
Oh yeah, I liked the good ending that they gave us for the series. That was a very nice touch. Where they're walking down a hallway arm in arm, and they're just just the contentment of old age. They're like, oh, finally, even though like politics didn't go very well towards the end, but you still got most of what you wanted. Basically, it's a very good ending. I thought.
Yes, I mean, and something also as you mentioned is, I think in the final episode they go and see Godolphin, who's ill and wrapped up in a blanket. And I think it's implied that he's near death's door as well, and I think he does die around the end of the war, historically. But of course, their eldest child is married to Godolphin, um, and then obviously their younger child's married to Sunderland, who's going to be a prominent politician going forward. And now, before we wrap this up, Mandrill, I just want to discuss some of the more brighter narrative construction. Now we've kind of gone through the whole series. So I think we were sort of discussing it before we went live that obviously this series was largely based on a biography done by Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill of Marlborough, his ancestor. And one of the motivations I think he had for doing this was because obviously he was the Prime Minister during the Second World War, and this is very much a narrative of Boomer truth. That Churchill was this grand warlord of England who led us in this titanic climactic struggle with the mid-century Germans, and his nemesis in Adolf Hitler, and he delivered us from domination by this foreign power. And obviously, I think there's a lot of question marks over that narrative, certainly, as you and I both well know. But what I find interesting is that I almost feel when you look at Marlborough and the way the history is taught about him and it's showed in this series, I almost can't help but Churchill is trying to weave a sort of similar narrative for Marlborough. It's almost like Marlborough is to Churchill what Louis XIV was to Adolf Hitler, basically. He's like this ever-present, like, continental tyrant that's going to threaten the stability and order of Europe, and England, under this brave sort of Churchillian hero, has to come and, like, save the day, ultimately.
Well, that's an interesting comparison to make, and I don't think that it has some truth to it, right? England's position historically has always been against the solidification of a continental power bloc. This England has always found small powers on the continent to back, whether it's the Dutch Republic, whether it's Prussia, whether it's playing the Holy Roman Empire off of the French or the Spanish or vice versa. It doesn't matter. They always typically do this. This is just like a perennial form of English foreign policy, specific and British foreign policy by extension. So I find it very interesting that this, as a historical parallel, is something that is omnipresent in the story and among other narratives as well. I think this is like I'm fairly a bit of a geopolitical, not just a realist, but also a bit of a geographical determinist. And so I think that since we mentioned a little bit about the nature of the English and why they might be considered so liberal in terms of individual rights and taxation and conscription and levy, because they don't need a standing army. I think there's a reason why they do the things that they do, and that reason ultimately boils down to much of geography and its interplay amongst nations. And of course, England doesn't really need to, I basically agreeing that the stereotype of perfidious Albion is pretty much accurate. Because, and I say that without any reservation, because this is something that the British government just tends to do and is incentivized to do based off of its geography, based off of its position. So like, there's just no way of avoiding this perception, at least from a continental point of view.
Well, it's not entirely inaccurate, but one thing I would say that I think is a bit stretched is I don't think it's quite a fair comparison to compare the British position in World War II or even World War One with that of the Britain in previous centuries, because in the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries, Britain, yes, did back up smaller powers against larger ones, and because there's a sensible reason to do that. We don't want these continental hegemons. We don't want Louis XIV, or we don't want Napoleon, or we don't want the Germans being too strong. But the thing is, Britain in those times, our government was much more sensible, and if a lesser power we were backing up couldn't carry on, or we couldn't keep them saved, we would always sign peace at a reasonable point, because we ultimately want to preserve our own interests, and we're not going to fight wars indefinitely if it's going to bankrupt us. The problem with World War II is the lesser power we were backing up, Poland, we did absolutely nothing to do to try and defend them. They were just overrun by the Germans straight away, and we didn't then do the reasonable thing and even try to come to an accommodation with the Germans and peace them out. It was like, no, we're going to never surrender. We're going to keep fighting even if it damages us. So I almost feel like what Winston Churchill's trying to do, perhaps under the surface, with this biography that inspired the show, is that it's almost like retroactively trying to sort of justify his own his own record in government of the Second World War.
That's a very interesting take. I mean, of course, we live under Boomer truth as a truth regime, and you can see this pattern of behavior playing out even in other places today, especially with Ukraine. This idea of we have to back this power until the death, basically, and force them to continue fighting no matter what. I mean, maybe you could argue that this was a little bit of the case with Prussia and the British relationship with Prussia, maybe less so than Ukraine, definitely, because at least peace did eventually come. But I don't see.
Oh, yeah, so just to quickly come in there. Well, the thing is, the reason Frederick the Great had to sue peace is because once the British had destroyed the French in North America, we signed a separate peace deal with the French and the Austrians. And so Frederick the Great was left for the last year of the 7 Years' War on his own. And that's what forced him to sue for peace with a status quo ante bellum in the end, because we literally threw him under the bus towards the end. And that's my point I'm trying to make, Mandrill. We were self-interested first. So once we got what we wanted, we were pretty happy to throw others under the bus, whereas in World War II, I don't think we were self-interested enough.
Yeah, and I think that's also probably true in Ukraine, because the question of what is the British government actually getting out of it. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But you can see that the historical patterns that, at least on a broad scale, don't seem to change through the centuries. I think that this is something that is observable, and I don't think it's necessarily going to go away. I think that geography is what it is, and that creates the relations between powers and how they act. So, yeah, I think that England is the way it is for a very, very specific reason. And I'm a little bit hesitant to do historical revisionism on Churchill's, at least Marlborough's, record, because I actually liked Marlborough as a character in the series. Like, he's a very fascinating character to watch.
Oh, no, certainly. And the only thing I would say is I do think the real Marlborough was probably a bit more practical and self-interested, more so than he's portrayed in the show. But, I do agree. I like the show and I do like his portrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And just another point to go back to Winston Churchill, again, trying to echo this sort of myth of Marlborough, the great military hero, and Churchill being his descendant. It should be noted that because the Marlborough's son, John Churchill, died when he was 17 of smallpox, there was no male heir. So the Churchill line actually went extinct in the male line. And it was actually the eldest daughter, Henrietta, who married Godolphin's son, who inherits the title Duchess of Marlborough. But then, because I don't believe actually ended up having any living children, what then happened is the title then went through her younger sister Anne's son, Robert Spencer, the Earl of Sunderland. So the Spencer family then become the Dukes of Marlborough for the next several generations. And it's actually the fifth Duke of Marlborough in the 19th century. He actually changes the family name from Spencer to Spencer Churchill, quite deliberately to echo Marlborough. And then when we get to Winston Churchill himself, he was actually born Winston Spencer Churchill, and he deliberately changed his name when he was, I think, at boarding school from Spencer Churchill to just Churchill. So again, so you see that there's this deliberate association he's trying to conjure.
It's a marketing move. Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you see where I'm coming with. There's just too many of these little facts to it's not a coincidence, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, right. See, okay, so I was actually unaware that there was a far less direct relationship in terms of descent between the Duke of Marlborough and Winston Churchill.
No, 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 sorry, no. He is the direct descendant. It's
But
just
through
that,
the female line, not through the male line. Yeah,
exactly, yeah.
yeah. That's very interesting, and well, maybe there's some observations that could be had in terms of behavior there, but I don't know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh,
Mm.
so one. Sorry, I've lost my thought now. There's one last thing I was going to say. Oh, yeah, and another thing to add to buttress this idea of him being very conscious of, to draw a comparison again between the politics of the 17th century and the World War II. In the Adam Curtis documentary series, which AA's been going through, in the series called An Ocean Apart, there's an episode dealing with Churchill and FDR in World War II. And there's a clip where Churchill is giving his thoughts after the, I think it's the Tehran conference in 1943, where it was FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. And Churchill said, because at that point he was starting to feel, I think we might have made a mistake in working with the Soviets and we've given them far too much. And he says, then he makes a comparison back to the Anglo-Spanish War under Cromwell, where he says, Cromwell, by siding with France to bring down the great power of Spain, he failed to see the rise of France to Louis XIV. I wonder if people will say the same of me with Stalin. So there's these interesting parallels. So it's like the comparison clearly was on his mind. So again, I have to wonder if Churchill thought my legacy may be quite negative. I need to shore it up to make it a more positive one.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And retroactively, I mean, like I haven't actually gone into some of the more forbidden sources on the subject, but the impression that I get for Winston is that he is a master marketer, but he unfortunately is not somebody who's actually very competent in the military affairs that he's trying to do. I think his record's very clear on that, and I don't see him being maybe deserving of the reputation as a supreme warlord that he gets. I think that definitely could be taken down a notch. But I mean, he unfortunately, the way that most people think of these things is, well, but you were on the winning side. But of course, the main point about British victory in the Second World War is, well, but did you really win? Even if you're winning as a bankrupted junior partner, did you actually win? And I'm not sure that the answer is yes. But
no, certainly not. No, and again, just to talk about this idea, I mean, we talked about the portrayal of Marlborough in the show, and it may not be entirely accurate, but one thing I will say with confidence is Marlborough's reputation as one of the sort of greatest military commanders in history, I think, is well deserved. And Winston Churchill, I'm sorry, you are not. How much you may like to LARP as a commander in chief, you are not your ancestors' descendant in the military department. I'm sorry. I think we can
yes,
say that with confidence.
yes, I would very much agree on that in terms of record and the differential in quality. I mean, you can almost kind of see, at least with the portrayal in the series, that the Churchill family through Marlborough is kind of on the up and up, and by the time it gets to Churchill, it's already maybe reached its apex, and they're starting to decline in a bit of quality, even though they're still rattling around in the high places of high politics. So the question of whether the status is deserved becomes a preeminent. It's definitely in the foreground.
No, certainly, and it's interesting because even though Churchill himself was born in Blenheim Palace, this is Winston Churchill. He was actually from a lesser known, more impoverished wing of the family, and so they weren't exactly born into into stupendous wealth, and so I think there was a certain sense of that he had ambitions, shall we say, Winston, which he wanted to follow up on.
Hmm. Well, he
Well,
certainly shares that with his ancestors. So that's my last comment.
thank you so much again for doing this. Is there anything you would like to share before we get out of here?
Sure. I would like people to go check out my Substack, and also my YouTube, and also the Old Glory Club's associated accounts too. So do go check that stuff out. I just had an article come out a couple weeks ago, which was a response to Praise of Folly on. It was more of an autistic philosophical deep dive on this residual question that tends to flare up on the state of paganism. And the Old Glory Club, I wrote an article behind their paywall, which was about Warhammer 40K and the recent Space Marine 2 game that just came out. I was making my commentary on Sargon's gaming stream because, obviously Sargon has had his channel restarted, and so he's been playing Vidya, and I've been greatly enjoying watching that. And of course, the Warhammer setting is one which is near and dear to my heart. So I was inspired to write that article a week or two ago. So do go check those out. Those are available to go consume as content. I have other stuff that's in the works. So make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe.
Oh, thank you. And in terms of this channel, join me next week for the next episode of the Archival Discourses. Not quite sure what topic or what guest I'll have, but once I know, I'll obviously get that announced. And so yeah, and obviously last Saturday. Sorry.
One last show. I'm sorry, I forgot. So yeah, tomorrow in the evening, U.S. time, I'll be going live with I think Hunger the Die Merchant and Charlemagne on Charlemagne's channel, and we have a little cigar bet that we are going to resolve, and it's on the question of the outcome of Ukraine over the past year. So do go check that out on Charlemagne's channel tomorrow.
Wonderful. I'll be giving that a watch, and you must have read my mind because I was just about to show, because the Saturday just gone, I had Hunger on, and we were discussing the next episode of our series on the Chatham House version by Eli Kaduri. We were discussing the fate of Middle Eastern minorities, Armenians, Assyrians, and Mizrahi Jews. So if you find that interesting, give that a watch. But thank you everybody for watching, and good night.